right. All right, awesome. So thank you so much, Joann, for joining us. And this is for the HR Change Management course through DU, University College. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your background in compensation with regard to specifically change management, but a little bit more about you first.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me to talk with your class today. I spent the first 15 years of my HR career working in-house at 4 different large companies in the Denver metro area. And then I spent the last 6 years as an external compensation consultant. And when I was in-house, I always enjoyed working on projects. That's what I really thrived on, was doing big projects for the organization that, yes, were implementing some sort of change, some sort of initiative. So that's what I really liked about my in-house jobs. And so going into consulting, it's been a nice next phase of my career because I get the opportunity to partner with a lot of different organizations on projects related to compensation. I've spent most of my career, so now, about 20, 21 years, I've spent all of that in human resources and the vast majority of that specifically in compensation. So that's a little bit about my background.
Awesome. Great. So tell us, if you could just brainstorm through some of the change initiatives you've been a part of, either directly or indirectly. Let's start with that, and then we'll kind of filter into the role of compensation within those. But what kind of change management initiatives have you been involved in?
Yeah, so I would say there's 2 that happen most frequently. The first is developing pay ranges for the organization. So that's establishing a minimum and maximum rate of pay that will be paid for each job. And what that does for the organization is that it provides guardrails and a framework for making pay decisions. So in absence of having established pay ranges, you're going to have leaders making pay decisions based upon a lot of different information, maybe using different criteria. You're not going to have a set established method for determining the pay as you recruit new hires, as you promote people from within. You're not going to have that consistent system for making pay decisions. So developing pay ranges really gives the organization, it gives leaders tools, a consistent framework for making those pay decisions. So that's kind of a foundational thing that I have worked on in compensation. And obviously, if it's an organization that's never had established pay ranges before, that's going to be a big change, because now instead of leaders just being able to hire someone or promote someone and pay them maybe whatever they wanted or whatever they could convince senior leadership to approve, now you actually have an established range of pay that you need to operate within, and you have set criteria for doing that. So that's, I would say that's primarily or predominantly the focus of a lot of my work, is the pay range piece, and that would be a base pay range, because for any organization, the base pay for the vast majority of jobs is the base expense of the company. And when you think about a business and what they're spending to run their business, that cost of labor, what you're paying to hire and retain talent, is the major expense for any organization. So taking the time to develop a framework of pay ranges and having that established really helps, with cost control. And it doesn't mean that you're trying to pay everyone less. It just means, how do you most effectively allocate your payroll dollars? Because any organization has a finite amount of money they can spend for talent. So how do you best allocate that? And we can talk more specifically about what that looks like with pay range development, but that would be the first kind of a foundational thing that I would help organizations with.
Okay. All right. What are some other, for instance, when you talk about setting up these pay ranges, and I love the idea of you're doing this so that basically you're providing leaders more autonomy in a way, right? And guardrails around how to determine pay for individuals. So you're giving them the guidance that it's more structured. But when a company hires you to do this, whether you're internal or you're external, why are they wanting to do that? What's the impetus for them saying, we need this? What kind of change are they going through that requires this?
Yeah, so I would say there's typically 5 key drivers. The first is internal equity, which is this notion of fairness in pay practices. It's not that everybody's being paid the same, but that you're being consistent, that you have a set, clear philosophy in how you pay people, and that's executed consistently across the organization. So that internal equity to really drive fairness between one employee to the next and how people are paid. A second key driver would be external competitiveness. So for the talent that you need, what in the external market is a competitive rate of pay? So part of what I do is gather external market data to understand the external piece. A third driver is to have that business tool, those guardrails, that framework to support pay decisions so that leaders have a better understanding and can more clearly articulate, they're having pay conversations, that this is a tool that allows them to have clear conversations with new hires coming in, existing people in the organization, that it's really a business tool for the organization to articulate pay. The fourth driver I would say is cost control. I spoke to that a little bit earlier, but that you are clearly understand how your labor dollars are being spent. And you may find when you go through this sort of project that you have areas of the business where you're underpaying people, compared both to the external market and compared internally with their peers. And then you might find that in other areas of the organization, you're overpaying. So you're paying more than you need to for certain roles. So that cost control and really understanding where your money is spent. And then the final thing I would say is that it helps support career progression. So if you've never had established pay ranges and you never capped what you're paying for a position, somebody may just decide, well, why do I want to go do something new? I'm just comfortable where I'm at. I can stay in this entry-level role and just get increases year after year. And I've worked with organizations like that where they may have had somebody in the same role for 20 years, making like twice as much as somebody coming brand new into the role because they just stayed in that role for so long. And there was never, it just never really a pay driver for having to change jobs. So I would say those are typically the key main drivers and why organizations would use develop pay ranges.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Something else comes to mind, and we certainly ran into this at Vail Resorts, is compression, right? So if you can talk to us a little bit about, so as we all know, like pay does motivate. It's not the motivator, but it certainly motivates people to do things. For instance, the career progression, I love that example, right? Is somebody, if they're comfortable, they'll stay in a role forever. They just keep getting their merit increase and, their market increase every year, and they're happy. But by capping particular roles and pay ranges within those roles, people might get up to that place and say, okay, if I want more, I need to actually step into a supervisory or a manager role and continue to develop their careers that way. But when they do that, right? So talk to us about how external forces sometimes creates compression between different roles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely having pay ranges and caps in place helps to address compression, because in the example I was just referring to, if a worker bee is in their job for 20 years and their pay is never capped, they may be making more than their supervisor. So that's another thing that can help support internal equity and making sure that doesn't happen. What I'm seeing more and more is compression at the lower ends of the scale, because there continue to be minimum wage increases. The city of Denver became the first municipality to pass a city minimum wage, and it's really driving wages up. You probably noticed, if you go to McDonald's, there's like starting $15 an hour, So that compression is really happening at the lower ends, where say, 5 years ago, a job like that would have paid $10 an hour. So a 50% increase is pretty significant. So the compression is happening a lot at the lower ends of the wage scale. So my clients that hire, have a lot of employees at doing more of those lower paid jobs, that's where they're starting to see a lot of compression, is because the pay, those minimum wage increases and that minimum going up, I think $15 is kind of becoming the new minimum standard, and what organizations are going to pay for the most junior level position, even if they are in a service industry or something that is more of a minimum wage job. So that's creating compression, because where in your organization, maybe you had your entry level role, and then you had like an intermediate person who had 1 or 2 years experience doing that. And then you had a lead, and then you had a supervisor. Well, maybe historically the supervisor was like 15 and the entry person was like 10, and there was that progression, but now you're starting people at least 15. So what can happen is, if you don't, as you bring up the bottom and you bring people up to that $15 minimum, if you don't also address for the next levels in the chain, your leads, your supervisors, if you don't also give them corresponding increases, you're going to have compression, and you're going to have people at the multiple layers in the organization making the same or quite similar pay. However, you're expecting more for people at the higher level. So I think a lot of times when there's a minimum wage mandate, by law you have to pay at least this much, employers have to do that. So that gets approved. There's no pushback from finance because that's required by law. But getting the approval to go a step further and do compression adjustments. Okay, now we also need to pay, our leads need to be making now like 17 an hour, and our supervisors 20 an hour. The cost really starts to add up. But if you don't do that, you're going to have internal equity issues, because you've now compressed pay. So compression is definitely becoming more of an issue. The other area you'll see it is with these really hot technical skills, like say software developers are really in demand in the market, and you will have people externally, you go to hire for a new software developer, and all of a sudden the market's demanding like 20% more than you're paying for your existing software developers. That's another area where you can have compression, is the market for certain jobs is just moving so fast that your internal pay practices, if you're only doing a 3% merit increase, that's not keeping up with the 20% increase you're seeing in the market. So that's another example where you might see compression, and dealing with compression issues is not cheap. However, it's better to be proactive and understanding that, it's to ultimately do what is right, both from an internal equity and external competitiveness standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you notice when companies don't act fast enough and kind of right that compression issue? What do you notice just in terms of, employees' motivation and engagement?
Well, you'll see that more and more. This is the other thing I wanted to speak to, is this notion of transparency, and pay practices are transparent. There's a number of reasons for that, but it's not, we don't live in a day and age anymore where people don't talk about pay and it's all secretive and people aren't talking. People know. And in Colorado, with the passage of the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act that just went into place on January 1st, employers are required to post a pay range when they're hiring for a job and posting that job. So, if you have people internally, say like that software developer example I was saying, if you have a software developer that goes out and sees like, oh, there's this new position my company is hiring for my role. We have another role on our team, and they can now see what the pay range is, and they can see, well, maybe I'm at the minimum of this range. And then someone coming in is going to be potentially making more than me, or at least the same as me, coming in new. So there's a lot more transparency and a lot more understanding of what the market going rate is. And then employees are not only going to see, like for your own job, what the hiring range is, but also they're going to see for other employers what they're being paid. And if they don't feel that they're being paid fairly, then you risk losing them. And when it gets to the point where they've already started applying for other jobs, and you get into a counter offer situation, they come to you and say, oh, I have this offer with this other employer and it's 20% higher. It's just a no-win game. Somebody's already started applying, the damage is done. There's not much, the vast majority of the time, it's not going to work out for that person to stay. You know, trust has been lost because the person has thought about leaving. To that point where they've already entertained an offer from somebody else, they're likely not going to stay, even if you counter. So, you know, being proactive, what I typically would recommend is at least on an annual basis, preferably more often, that you budget dollars for pay adjustments and you do a competitive review and you're identifying areas in the organization where you may need to be, you're behind market, or, you know, you've had new hires come in, you have compression, that you have a process for regularly looking at that and making adjustments where needed.
Yeah, yeah. You know, so what about considering total comp in that as well? You know, for instance, if a company is unable to make that leap at that higher level, because again, the entry level, you know, minimum wage is kind of compressing up, are there other unique ways of keeping that supervisor and that manager engaged and feeling as though there is equity, even if they're not able to put it in their salary?
Yeah, an organization may put in place a bonus plan. You'll see those more often at management levels and above. So with a management role, you know, having more direct impact to the bottom line of the business, giving them some skin in the game. And if the company has a good year, then everyone shares in that success. So you will see bonus plans. The vast majority of organizations have them in place for managers and above. There's also other organizations that have them in place for all employees. So all employees are part of a bonus plan, and that bonus plan could be tied to individual results, it could be tied to team results, or it could be organizational wide. You know, at the simplest level, it could be a profit sharing plan where the company has a set profit target, and if that's met, then there's a distribution to everyone. At the individual level, it could be specific goals tied to your specific contributions. If you meet these goals, if you meet this performance level, then you know you get a 10% of your base pay paid out as a bonus. Or at a team level, it could be team goals that it's tied to, or team performance. So bonus is certainly one way. You know, what we see with startups and other organizations that maybe are, you know, they're just getting started, they're short on cash, they may do stock options. So it's giving folks, you know, down the road when the company goes public, they have the option to purchase stock at a set price. And so one way that, you know, startups can kind of compete with other organizations is getting people on board that want the opportunity to be part of building something and potentially have reap the rewards, but it's going to be down the road. So a lot of times with stock options, there's maybe a 4-year vesting schedule, so you don't have full ownership of those stock options until you've been with the organization for 4 years. And so it also could be a retention tool that people have to stick around in order to receive it. You know, even an annual bonus plan could be a retention tool, because if it gets paid out just once a year, you might want to stick around till the end of the year to get that payout. So those are kind of, I would say those are kind of the key things that employers do. But beyond compensation, beyond pay, there are a lot of intangibles. You know, the work environment, the culture, how much flexibility do you give to people? You know, can they work remotely? Can they work flexible hours? Those intangibles are becoming even more and more important. You know, it's the world of work has changed, and there's a lot of people who value flexibility, and you know, the culture can be just as important. You know, once a certain level of compensation is met, it's really those things that get people to stay.
Yeah, so true, so true. Okay, so tell me a little bit about backfiring. So what I mean by that is, like, bonus paid out at a certain time of the year. How can that backfire, meaning that there's people who are just hanging on till that date, and then there's like this mass exodus? I've certainly seen that as well. So from a compensation perspective, how do you overcome that type of behavior?
Well, I have seen that happen as well. You know, if people are only hanging on for that last bonus payout, it's not necessarily that you want them hanging on any longer. You know, they probably are ready. It's the right move for them. So, you know, I don't know if there's a way around that piece. That certainly can happen. You know, I think understanding as people leave the organization, if you understand why they're leaving, and if you are having a mass exodus, people are just sticking around for the bonus payouts. You know, if it becomes really problematic, then you may want to rethink how your plan is designed, and understand why that's happening. So there's going to be some of that, but hopefully, you know, you understand why.
Right, right. So in terms of using compensation for a particular, say it's a culture change, or say it's a bringing a new product to market, or, you know, a new service or something like that, how might you use, let's just pick one of those. Let's say there's a company that's bringing a new product or service to market. And how might you utilize compensation to help people focus on that rather than, say, some of the older products or services that still need to, you know, continue to be supported, but we need to get this one out? Is there a way of using compensation for something specific like that?
That would be a great opportunity for a short-term incentive plan. Short-term is anything less than a year. And so you could target certain milestones that you want met. Maybe it's 3 months out, 6 months out, 12 months out, whatever the criteria are. But if you have set milestones, you can then incentivize individuals and or teams for meeting those milestones. And if you put an incentive bonus behind meeting those, that's going to drive focus. The other thing to keep in mind with incentives is that if everything is important, nothing's important. So getting really clear on what is truly important. I would recommend no more than 3 metrics or criteria. If we get more than 3, then it can become, well, my attention is so divided. You know, if my bonus is based upon 10 things, each component is only 10% of that. And you may just totally neglect 1 or 2 of those because it's not worth, oh, that's too much of a headache. You just totally disregard. But if you only have 3, then you have a lot of skin in the game for each one. So that's the other thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about incentives, is to get really clear on what's the most important and to determine, you know, okay, if I only want to set 3 targets, 3 things that need to be met, what are the most important? So you could keep really people focused. So a lot of times brainstorming and trying to develop an incentive plan, you'll find that there's kind of overarching, you know, maybe there's a lot of different things you want to accomplish, but what are the key things, key drivers that are going to get you there? So identifying and prioritizing what those are.
Okay, so give us an example of when you've been in a situation, if you've been in a situation like that, and perhaps from a compensation perspective, you could see clearly what needed to be rewarded and incentivized, and yet maybe senior leaders were seeing it differently. And how do you navigate and negotiate and facilitate through that to land at the right place?
So I'll give you an example from Vail Resorts, because we had, interestingly, probably the most complex incentive plan I've ever worked with was ski instructors. I had no idea it could be. So the first challenge was that the different ski resorts, and I don't know if this is still the case because now I left there 7 years ago, but at the time, each of the ski resorts was incentivizing ski instructors differently. So the goal or the project that I was on was to align the practices and also to make it less complicated, because there were like 10 plus different things depending on the resort that were being incentivized. So it was really difficult to explain to new people when they came on board, very cumbersome to administer, And then also just really not really driving a focused attention on, what's really important. So there would be like different incentives for whether you taught kids versus adults versus private versus group versus, just very complicated. So in digging into that project and working closely with the leader of each of the ski schools, each of the resorts, it became clear what the primary drivers were to the success of the ski school. It was two things. It was, nice to jog my memory from 7 years ago, but it was returns. So how many people are returning to your class? If you teach them one day, how many are coming back for another class? So that was a key driver. And the next driver, I'm totally drawing a blank. Was two key things. Anyway, it became abundantly clear, like those were the two key things that were the most important to the success, financial success of the ski school. And also the two key things that really were a demonstration of the fact that their customers were happy. So there was this wide agreement that these were the two metrics that were the most important. So that came through pretty early on in the project. That was identified and there was agreement on that. But then ultimately, there was a lot of apprehension about making any changes to anyone's incentive, and that if we change this, some people are going to come out ahead, some people are come out, there'll be winners and losers, and there's a lot of fear around the losers and people potentially making less money because, okay, now there's like 10 other things I used to get incentivized on. Now we're not gonna shrink the pool of money we're spending on incentive comp. We have the company's gonna spend, reward people just as much. It's just gonna be focused on these two key metrics. But at the end of the day, if there were some people that were more focused on these other things that the business determined are as important, those are no longer getting paid out. So ultimately, there was a lot of apprehension, and we ended up pressing pause, didn't implement it. And the decision when I left the organization was, let's track concurrently for the whole ski season what people would have made under their existing incentive plan and what they would make under the new plan. We had done some historical analysis, so I had the historical data to show who would be the winners and losers, but they wanted one more year to look at that data and really understand who was going to be impacted the most. So for me, whenever I'm working on something, if we're doing the project, we're doing the work, we spend a lot of time and energy to develop what we thought was the right incentive plan, have a consistent, streamlined plan for everyone. So for me, it was a little disappointing that I didn't get to see it actually be implemented. Yeah. That, at the end of the reservation about making any change, because change is hard. It does require communication, change management, and there was just a lot of apprehension about making that change. And in my opinion, a little too much focus on the negative, like what would be the negative perceptions or who was going to be negatively impacted versus there was a whole lot of positive. And, and let's focus on the positive, and this is going to be so much easier to communicate and explain. It's going to be the same plan across resorts. So as people, a lot of the ski instructors may work at more than one resort. So now it's the same plan and we're not competing against each other, and, fear about what's really important, and they can really focus on those two metrics versus their attention being divided. So yeah, that was a little disappointing for me. In all of my work, I take the approach of beginning by listening to leaders. So at the start of any compensation initiative, really to get the buy-in and support from leaders, that you're engaging with them up front, speaking with key leaders to understand what's going on and get their direction, their buy-in. So this is just one example of, although we did that, at the end of the day, it didn't come to fruition. And hopefully since then, like maybe after I don't know if they ended up changing it, but hopefully usually what happens is when you engage leaders up front and you bring them along the way, when you get to the end, there's excitement and there's buy-in for moving forward. So I just say that's kind of, in my career, an exception to that. So just a reminder that even if you go through all the right steps and you think you've done all the right things, at the end of the day, sometimes the change is just, the organization isn't quite ready yet.
Yeah, so true. So speaking of that, because we've been talking about, kind of building that alliance for change and who you communicate to and how do you communicate with them and who do you communicate at certain times and that type of thing. So with this, granted, you weren't able to see it all through, but you talked a lot about this apprehension. Who was the apprehension coming from? Was it coming from the head of the ski patrols at each of the resorts, or was it that the message was trickling down to the instructors and they were getting concerned about it? Do you even know?
So, on the project team, we had the director of each ski school, and we weren't communicating things down to the instructor level. We were waiting until they knew that project was going on. There had been focus groups to gather their feedback and input. But what we were proposing, we didn't go and get their input on it. So the apprehension was coming from the directors, the leaders, and thinking about, they had the data to show how this is going to impact their different instructors, and just concern about the change and how it would be perceived. And I think, at the end of the day, nobody really knows until it happens, but that was the perception, and just not there being a negative backlash.
Right. Yet at the same time, I love how you talk about, not so much focusing on the negative, but really focusing on the positive and being able to paint that positive picture as to, all right, what's in it for me? Well, now, if I used to work at Breckenridge and I want to go over to Keystone, or I want to go to Whistler or wherever, that then I'm able to slip into that new role and understand the pay structure, and there's some consistency with it, and not have that internal competition, right? Like Keystone's stealing from Breckenridge because they pay higher or whatever it might be. Really interesting.
It is interesting because, the saying, the grass is always greener on the other side. There's usually this perception that, oh, it's different over there and it must be better over there. Like, and why aren't we doing it that way? So there can be that misperception. I think the other challenge with compensation, and anytime you do a compensation project, is nobody thinks they're underpaid, or overpaid, sorry. Right. Nobody thinks like, there's so when you do any sort of comp project or initiative, there's this maybe expectation from employees that they're going to get a raise. Oh, they're looking at compensation. Well, I definitely am undervalued, underpaid. Like, there's kind of an expectation that, well, certainly my position's going to get an increase if it's being reviewed, because it's just kind of a perception, which is why now that organizations are becoming more transparent with their pay ranges, how pay is determined, that can help kind of alleviate maybe some misconceptions. I think of even in my own career, my very first HR job, like a year out of college, and merit increases came around, and I got this fantastic performance review, this glowing, I'm doing such a great job. And then my merit increase was 4%. Yeah. And I remember 4%, for some reason, I had in my head, because, I didn't know anything about compensation. I had in my head I was going to get like 10% increase because I was doing such a great job. Thankfully, this leader was a good communicator, and she explained to me that the budget was 3%. So on average, employees were getting 3%. And she talked me through how for her team, it has to average out to 3%. And for her to give me 4% meant somebody else was getting 2%. And she talked me through how, the budget and how it was determined. And then all of a sudden I understood, okay, 4% is not bad. It's actually good. And I understand why. But without that knowledge, not understanding that, oh, the budget is 3%, and that's actually a standard merit budget in the market, coming in, my first corporate job, I just was clueless, and I would, without that context, I would have felt like I wasn't being valued. I just, so that understanding and transparency, the fact that she was transparent with all of that information, it gave me the confidence that I was being paid appropriately, and just that having that understanding was really helpful.
Right, right. And at the same time, I've been in that same situation, by the way. I'm like, what? That's all I'm getting? But I'm a rock star. Come on. Right. So how do you use compensation to motivate individually? Right. Like, so for instance, some people are perfectly fine. They're finding different motivations. Other people really want to see that dollar amount increasing over a period of time. So how do you use compensation to essentially motivate different values of individual employees?
So, this comes down to leadership development and developing leaders to be good managers, and to understand their employees and what their drivers are, to treat them as individuals and people. On the compensation side, you're going to want to treat people equitably. So, for the job they're doing, what's the competitive rate of pay, what's internally equitable to pay them at, and as you're doing increases, that you're evaluating people against the same criteria. So you want to have that clarity and consistency in how your pay decisions are being made, regardless of, just because one person values comp more doesn't mean, well, I'll give all the merit money to that person. This other person's just fine, so I don't give anything to them. So you're going to have this pay decisions made fairly and under consistent criteria. But then beyond that, if somebody is really driven, if they're monetary, if the money side is really important to them, and they're really driven, then that could be a career progression conversation. So, hey, you really want to make more money, then let's talk about avenues you could take to promote yourself in the organization. What do you want to do next? Because if you just stay in this job, probably 3% merit budget every year. So you're going to get like a 3% increase every year. If you really want to grow in your pay and grow and take on more responsibility, then let's talk about ways you can do that, versus somebody else on your team may not be interested in promotions. I know for myself personally, I started my career really driven. I was like climbing the corporate career ladder, and then I got into management and realized I preferred being an individual contributor and being a little worker bee versus managing a team. So for me, I actually decided I want to take a step back, and I took a pay cut to take on less because I wanted more. There's other things in my life that were more important, and I just preferred, being an individual contributor. So, it didn't mean I couldn't be successful. I found roles that were the right fit for me, but I hindered my compensation by making that decision. But at the end of the day, it was the right decision for me, and I was happier. So I think that probably comes into play more with the type of job somebody is in and their trajectory with the organization.
Right. Okay. So I know I've given you on your calendar just one more minute, but can you stay a few more minutes? Because I have another question. Okay.
Yeah.
So along those lines, say there is a company who has had silos, right? So sales just goes up the sales silo, marketing goes up the marketing silo, HR, and so forth. And what their change initiative is to be able to bring those silos together, to be able to create a culture where there's a lot of cross-pollination and true teamwork across the operations. Now, scenario continues, right? Somebody from HR now wants to get over into sales, or somebody from one part of the business wants to go into a different facility or whatever. In order to go laterally, they might have to go down to go up. And so what I've seen is if it truly is compensation wise, go down to go up, people won't make that move. So therefore they won't be able to ultimately get where they think they are going to contribute the best, and the company loses out. So how do you create a compensation structure such that there can be cross training, if you will, without having to lose in compensation and, pay grade?
Yeah. So this is one of those situations where, well, it depends. So when you're transferring someone to a new role and you're thinking about what to pay them for the new role, you're going to have to look at who else is on that team and what's fair for this new role and the others on the team. And where possible, you could keep their pay the same if it doesn't create an internal equity issue. So in a lateral move, ideally being able to keep the pay the same, organizations want to avoid giving people pay cuts unless it's a demotion or, this performance issue and we got to demote you down and you can't do as much.
Right.
For a lateral, ideally you want to keep people at least at the same pay. So if it's possible, looking at internal equity and the pay for that new team, if it's possible to keep pay the same, that would be ideal. But if you put them on this new team and all of a sudden, but then they're going to be paid like 20% more than the rest of that new team, and they're brand new to doing this function. So that would be a disservice to the rest of the team. That's just not fair or equitable. So what I would say is, okay, hopefully there's a path where after being in that role, say maybe a year, then there's a promotion or a next step up where they could get the pay back. So ideally, if there was a situation where you had to take pay away, because internally this would not be fair, that there's a plan for, well, within a year from now, we'll bump you back up to where you were because you'll have now a year experience under your belt, and you'll be able to move up into this higher level role. So, it's never ideal, and it is the exception that you would take pay away for a lateral move. But when you do have to do that there is a plan, a development plan where you can get that person back on track, which is again another reason why pay ranges can be so helpful, because if you know what the pay ranges are for each of those jobs and this new path they're taking, then you can clearly see what it's going to take to get there. And what, hopefully if somebody does have to take a step back, it's a short term, very short term, and in the long run, that they're going to be better off.
Right. Yeah. So that really highlights the connection between compensation, performance management, and development, individual development plans, and even having career pathing within organizations. So people can see that, if I want to go over there, I might have to do this, but there's a system in place that once I come back up over here, maybe I get that pay increase and maybe even a bonus to make up for that lost, that lost compensation or something. So it really is so intertwined. So any advice that you would give the students around making sure that these three things are really closely intertwined? Again, compensation, performance management, and leadership development and talent development.
There's a lot of communication and training to make that happen. So, with my clients say, this project's going to be creating it all and developing it, but then it's going to take just as long to communicate, to implement it, get the change, and get the buy-in, training, communication. So a lot of times just keep in mind that you get to an end of a project, the training and communication can sometimes or often be just as much time as actually the development of whatever change it is. So just keep that in mind. And then the other thing would be, just starting with leadership engagement and engaging them throughout the way can pay huge dividends at the end. So, if leaders aren't willing to invest their time, then is it really worth doing? So if you don't have leaders saying, yes, I can take time and make time for this project and be engaged in it, and if you're not getting leaders to do that, then that could be a red flag that this project is going to be successful or it's not that important to the business. So sure that you have leaders engaged.
Okay, last question then, if you have another couple of minutes.
Okay.
Is taking that scenario and getting all of the leaders on the same platform, and making sure that, right, there's some leaders who are going to be easier raters, and so perhaps their team, compensation wise, is growing. Another leader is a tougher rater. So how do you make sure that there's equity across the organization from a performance management perspective and comp perspective?
Yeah, a lot of times organization will do calibration sessions. So after a leader has done their preliminary performance ratings before their final, that there's a collaborative meeting where they are level setting. Okay, you gave your top performance, you gave the top rating to these people, and you gave the top rating to these people. Let's talk about, okay, are those really the top people? And why do you only identified 5 and I identified 10? So that is another step organizations may take, is to be collaborative, have that collaborative meeting and discussion. Another approach organizations may take would be forced distribution. So forcing you to have a bell curve, so you can only give out this many top ratings, this many need to be at the average rating. So there's different ways to go about it. At the end of the day, a lot of organizations want to get at a nice bell curve where you have most of the people in the average rating, and then at the ends of the outliers, it's less people. There's different ways to go about that, but either forcing it or doing a calibration session is the two methods I've typically seen.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, thank you so much. So obviously compensation has a lot to do with change management. And it's interesting too, when you were talking about being super clear with what is the end goal and making sure that the compensation is going to drive towards that end goal and drive the behaviors towards that. And I think that right there is almost the more challenging part of it. Once you know that, it may be, I'm not compensation, so I don't know how easy it is, but it almost seems like that might be the easier task, is finally, putting the compensation structure together. It's more about getting clear on what do you want it to drive, and then communicating it out are the two more challenging parts.
Yeah, so you'll hear people talk about compensation philosophy. So what is your philosophy in how you pay people? And that then serves as your guiding principle for how you develop your program. So yes, there's a lot of time up front in identifying, what's your philosophy, what's your approach, and then making sure that whatever you develop aligns with that.
Yeah.
And it should tie to your.
And it's, tied to what?
It should tie to your business strategy as well. So, what is the company strategy? What are your mission, vision, values? What are your goals? What are you trying to drive? So that should all be tied to your compensation as well.
Right. And performance management. Are you weighting those competencies in your merit? Can really be a good driver as well for behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Joann. I really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, how to stop recording.